Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Avant de passer à l'anglais, je veux remercier tout le monde. It's a pleasure to have all of you from all around the world in science education. Alors, les didacticiens des sciences, merci d'être parmi nous. Nous accueillons aujourd'hui Felipe Sanchez-Gomez qui nous fait une présentation tout à fait d'actualité sur les relations entre l'enseignement des sciences et l'instabilité politique. So I'm going to let Felipe introduce himself, explain he's a PhD student. He's a student of my colleague Cristiano Matos. So, well, welcome Felipe, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sylvie. Good afternoon to all of you. My name is Felipe, as Sylvie already mentioned. I'm a PhD student from the University of São Paulo in Brazil, under the supervision of Cristiano here. We study science education, especially physics education. And let's do this, I guess. So
yes.
I would like to start this presentation by thanking you all for being here today, and thanking especially Professor Sylvie Barma for the invitation and the opportunity for me to share my work with you all. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about myself in a moment, but just so you can have an overview of what's going to happen today, I'm going to present myself, and later I'm going to be talking about political instabilities in Brazil and how it affected my research and my interests. So this is the second part. The third part is where I'm going to present to you a little bit of my research, which basically consists in understanding how science education changed during two specific periods in history, and where political instability was really clear. And the first one is the case of Nazi Germany, focused on the period before the World War II started. And the second case is the education in the United States during the first years of the Cold War. Finally, I'm going to give you my final considerations and my thoughts about this topic, and we can have a conversation and discuss some ideas. Well, so I come from Brazil, from a city called Osasco, which is this tiny little red dot here on the map. It's located in the state of São Paulo, which is here in white. And for those who don't know, São Paulo is located here in Brazil. São Paulo is the richest state, and it's quite far from Quebec, from Laval University. I have traveled over 12 hours to be here, and my city is not known for many things. Our postal card is this bridge, which is kind of dull, to say the least, but it's the route I take every day to go to university. We are also known in Brazil for our hot dogs. So we have a hot dog here in the picture. Actually, we are also known for malls, because we have over 5 malls in the city. We love malls. But the hot dogs are great. I recommend that you put mashed potatoes here, like we do, because it's really great. You love it. I mentioned São Paulo is the richest state in Brazil, and it's easy for you to believe that maybe we don't have the same problems as the poorest states. And the reality is that the poor and rich live next to each other, as is shown in this picture. This is a picture, it's not a montage. Here on the left, we have the second largest favela, which is a poor neighborhood. And on the right, bordering it, we have one of the richest neighborhoods in São Paulo. I live around 20 minutes from this place, but close to my house, I have another favela. There is another favela, which is smaller than this one, but they share similar problems, similar issues. They have poor basic sanitation and poor access to education and health, and usually criminality is high at these places. Another really big inequality we have in Brazil is due to our past with slavery. Brazil is actually the second largest, Brazil actually has the second largest Black population in the world. Nigeria is in first place, so we are the country with the largest Black population outside of Africa. This is huge, and our past with slavery was awful, and we still have this historical debt. This is a picture here of almost all of our presidents since the proclamation of our republic here in the 1889. And only one of them is considered to be a non-white man. Historians don't have a consensus for this, but even if we consider him to be a non-white person, it would mean that he's only one in over 50 people that governed our country. Another inequality is the fact that we only had one woman in our presidency, and she was impeached in a coup d'etat, forgive my French, please, that happened in 2016. Brazil has a lot of periods of political instabilities, and one of the most recent ones is the military dictatorship that began in the 60s and ended up in the 80s. In fact, that happened to almost all countries in Latin America during the second half of the 20th century. And it's kind of funny, I already showed here to you the military dictatorship period, but they all kind of look like military. In fact, our first president was a military, and a lot of them were after this. This is Dilma Rousseff, the woman president that I mentioned in 1970, when she was being judged for fighting against this military dictatorship I just mentioned. This picture is really interesting because while she's being accused, she's keeping her head high when her judges here in the back are hiding their faces. She played an important part during this period. She was actually arrested here, as you can see, but she was tortured. And it's really amazing to hear her talk about this period and how it made her stronger. Here she is again being judged now in 2016 when her impeachment process began. We say it's a coup d'etat because the crimes she was accused of in this period were just recently absolved. She was recently absolved of. This picture was taken in the parliament when she was being impeached then, and she defended herself for over 8 hours. It was a really intense process. But this process did not begin in 2016. It's an earlier process that began in 2015 during the first years or the first months actually of her second term when she won the elections in 2014. And people demand her impeachment or that she would step down from power. But this process is earlier still and began in 2013. This picture is from June 2013. These manifestations began mainly because people wanted more fight against corruption and more financial incentives for education and health. And here it's the Congress, it's our Congress. So already in 2013, we were seeing an invasion of the Congress, and it was really scared, but we at that moment, we didn't know what was going to happen, what was to come. And one thing that caught my attention during this period or during these demonstrations was the movement called School Without Party. They describe themselves as the most important and consistent initiative against the use of schools and universities for ideological, political, and partisan propaganda. It's the idea that, for example, teachers cannot teach about slavery because that would mean they are taking a side in history. This is really scary to me because as a teacher, it directly affects my career. And I begin to worry about this movement and what it could come of it. So it made me want to understand a little bit more about the relationships that were behind it. Right after the impeachment of Dilma, the president who took over power was Michel Temer, who is here. It was not Bolsonaro. And Michel Temer, actually, in the first months after the coup d'etat, he implemented a high school reform, which we call the new high school, and it was made by a provisional measure. The provisional measure is a legal device, I don't know if it exists in Canada, that allows the president to enact a law that has an expiration date. So the Congress must vote if it wants to turn it into a permanent law or not, if it wants to let it expire. So this process from implementing, enacting this law and the Congress converting into a permanent law took less than 6 months. So the impeachment happened earlier in 2016. By the end of 2016, we had a high school reform. And not only that, but in the last month of this new president, Temer's term, in December 2018, his government homologated the national learning standards, which are basically a federal curriculum that serves for primary and secondary education. Both events are hushed processes, and they really scared us due to the speed that they were implemented. But nothing could compare us to what was coming. And just last year, the MAC, which is the Ministry of Education, appointed an ally of the School Without Party to coordinate teaching materials. So now those people that basically believe some topics should be censored are the ones coordinating what materials can or cannot get to schools. So I began to research after this, and if other countries were going through educational reforms as we were. And I found out that many countries worldwide have been through educational changes in the last decade. So here we have only a few of them. Some authors, like Saltman and Means, that I put here on the bottom, attribute those changes to global institutions like OECD, the World Bank, forgive me, and the World Trade Organizations. Basically, these organizations have financial interests in this sector because the educational sector moves around $4 trillion worldwide each year. It's easy for us to believe that science education isn't going to be affected by these changes because science is neutral. We have a picture of science that can be translated as this painting on the left by René Marie, and we understand science as a painting of reality. So it shouldn't be affected by political views or personal beliefs. And it has allowed us to make some predictions. Science, it's really good for this, such as this one. We can see an egg and paint a bird. The problem is that this could be a reptile's egg, and we have to contextualize science and understand it better. We know that science has helped us and the world in many ways. It helped us win the World War II in specific ways, such as this computer that cracked the Nazi code, and in not so specific ways also. And as a teacher, I was caught, and I'm still caught in the middle of this turmoil that I just presented to you. And I begin to wonder, are there relationships or relations between science education and periods of political instability? Because I was, and I still am, interested in understanding the period I am living in and how it can affect my work. This was the reason I turned to a famous historical case where the government ideology was more explicit, which is the Nazi Germany. And here I focus on the period immediately before the World War II began, regarding changes that occurred between 1933 and 1939. I had the displeasure to read Mein Kampf, the book Hitler wrote in 1925 when he was imprisoned, because I needed to understand how he viewed science, education. I do not recommend that you do this, but I want to read you two parts that summarize what Nazi education would become. So here's the first one. He says that the folkish state has to start from the presumption that a man, though scientifically little educated, but physically healthy, who has a sound, firm character, filled with joyful determination and will of power, is of great value to the national community than an ingenious weakling. And he continues, A people of scholars, when they are physically degenerate, irresolute, and cowardly pacifists, will not conquer heaven. Nay, it will not even be able to assure its existence in this world. Later on in the same part, he says that school has to set apart infinitely more time for physical training. Not a day should pass during which the young man is not training physically in every kind of sport and gymnastics. Here, especially, one kind of sport must not be forgotten, which is considered as brutal and undignified, which is boxing. These views were materialized by the implementation of Nazi youth organizations. Children, both boys and girls, were compelled from the age of 10 to participate in such organizations. From the age of 10 until they turned 18, so 8 years of training. Erika Mann wrote a book called School for Barbarians in 1938. In this book, she tried to warn the world about the atrocities that were taking place at German schools. And she wrote, "But the German child is a Nazi child and nothing else. He attends a Nazi school, he belongs to a Nazi youth organization, the movies he is allowed to see are Nazi films, his whole life, without any reservations, belong to the Nazi state." The movie called Jojo Rabbit from 2019 is a good depiction of how this process worked. For those of you who didn't watch, I highly recommend it. I'm not going to spoil, but it's a story of a boy around 10 years that it's really excited to enter the youth organization. And he's so immersed in this ideology that Hitler is his imaginary friend. He has long talks with Hitler. It's funny in a way, it's a comedic movie, but it's really scary if you think about it. Teachers were also affected by changes that occurred in this period. There was the creation of the National Socialist Teachers League, NSLB in German, and the participation was not mandatory, but teachers would get a medal like these ones if they participated. So it's estimated that 97% of teachers were NSLB members in 1937. And that's not only because they followed the ideology or because they believed in it, but they would gain financial incentives if they participated. They would get better positions at universities, at schools, and that was really an incentive. Here we have a participation card, and we can see this teacher began their participation in September. It's the dates here, but we can see here also on the stem. And they participated in all of the reunions until 1937, even making a donation here in 1934. During this period, there was a movement called German physics. It was led by two important physicists and Nobel Prize winners, Philipp Lenard and Johannes Stark. Lenard actually wrote a book called German Physics in 4 volumes in 1938. In the introduction, he wrote, "German physics, these words will raise questions, and it is true that I could have said Aryan physics, or the physics of Norsemen, or the physics of those who have plumbed the depths of reality. But I must hear, science is and remains international. This is a mistake. Science is and remains, like everything created by the human mind, racially bound and a result of plot." The book covers mechanics, acoustics, thermodynamics, and electromagnetism. As we can see, even after over 30 years from special relativity and over 20 years of general relativity, neither of these topics are covered in this book as they were considered Jewish physics. Science education became Wehrwissenschaft, or science of defense. This changed the school curriculum. First, there was a division between boys' curriculum and girls' curriculum, where in physics, boys would learn about bombs, artillery, warcrafts, and warships, and girls would learn about how to take care of their babies and how to be good mothers. Both boys and girls had to learn how to identify a Jewish person, especially so they wouldn't fall in love and marry them, so they didn't procreate with what was understood as the enemy. And in chemistry, boys learned about grenades and their various types and effects, like gas grenades and mustard gas. Meanwhile, girls would learn about the chemistry of food so they could cook better for their family. This is a book from 1936, which we analyzed, and it's called Physics of Defense, a handbook for teachers. It was edited by Erich Gunther. According to Gunther, physics teaching could contribute to the national education in two ways. The first one was by teaching students about the struggles and achievements of German scientists. And the second one was to awaken the desire to defend the country by showing technical ways to do so. And Gunther viewed his physics lessons, or his book, as covering the second goal. And we have here the chapters of this book. It was divided in 8 chapters covering physics topics, but always contextualized in wars and battle. It also had over 300 exercises that he categorizes as class experiments, practical experiments for student equipment production, open field experiments, and theoretical exercises. So it had a lot of focus on experiments, on hands-on, on how to get things done. These are some pictures from the book, and as we can see, it has a lot of emphasis on guns and war equipment. But one chapter caught our attention, which is the third one. It's called Lessons from Shooting. From a more direct translation, it actually means the doctrine of the bullet. I'm not going to read all of these topics. You can see there's a lot, but in reality, in a quick analysis here, we can see that it uses bullets and guns as a way to contextualize physics topics, from the center of gravity to moment of inertia to movement with and without air resistance. It's really scary. Here represents some exercises from other books to show that many materials cover topics in a similar fashion. So we have here this first case that it says a bombing plane can be loaded with one explosive bomb of 35 kilograms, 3 bombs of 100 kilograms, 4 gas bombs of 150 kilograms, and 200 incendiary bombs of 1 kilogram. And it asks, what is the load capacity? What is the percentage of each type of bomb? How many incendiary bombs of half kilogram could be added if the load capacity were increased 50%? Another exercise says, an airplane flies at the rate of 240 kilometers per hour to a place at a distance of 210 kilometers in order to drop bombs. When may it be expected to return if the dropping of bombs takes 7.5 minutes? This one is even scarier. I'm not going to read all the details because it gets confused, but it says that every day the state spends some amount on cripples, on mentally ill people, on deaf people, and on feeble-minded, on alcoholic, on a pupil in care, and at a pupil with a pupil at a special school, and some amount with an ordinary pupil at an ordinary school. And it asks, what total cost do one cripple and one feeble-minded person create if one takes a lifespan of 45 years for each? And the second question is, calculate the expenditure of the state for one pupil in a special school and one pupil at an ordinary school over 8 years, and state the amount of higher cost engendered by the special school pupil. In this last case, they are basically trying to show students how much money could be saved if these people basically didn't exist. Now that we understand that science education is indeed affected by periods of political instability, I try to move closer to the context I live in. Brazil was and still is very affected by what we call the teaching project age, which can be considered here from the 60s to the 80s, and where many projects were developed during this period. Here we have the first one, which is PSSC, which is Physical Science Study Committee. It was created in the 1950s, 1956 to be precise, but it was released in 1960, sorry. And here we have a lot of other projects. Harvard, also from the same period, from the United States, have Nuffield from the UK, UNESCO from UNESCO, have some from the Netherlands, and all of those that are here are from Brazil. So in order to understand a little bit better about this period, I'm studying PSSC, which was the first teaching project or science teaching project that was created. And in order to understand that, I want to analyze this period right before it's released, because it was the period that impacted it the most, which is from 1950 to 1960. This is ongoing research. It's my PhD research, and it's structured as follows. I want to understand the cultural historical conditions in which PSSC was developed. So in order to do so, I need to understand the more immediate aspects that impacted this project. So as a science education material, it's necessary to understand the period's scientific and educational aspects. But these materials actually have a big impact from cultural aspects. So this cultural aspect is really important for my research. And these aspects that are here cannot be fully understood if we don't analyze the economical, political, and social conditions that encompassed it. So my research begins from the outside in, and the next part of my presentation is focused on the political, economic, and social aspects of the United States during the 1950s. Here are some important events that occurred during this decade. We had the end of the Second World War in 1945. Then the Cold War began in 1947. In the 1950, the Korean War started and the United States became involved. In 1955, the Vietnam War began, but the US wouldn't be more directly involved until later, but this is still an important part of this period. In 56, PSSC was created, and only 1 year after, there was the launch of Sputnik 1 in 57, and 3 years later, the first version of PSSC Physics would be released. So here are some of the places I gathered my sources from, but I want to focus on Fraser. Fraser is a repertoire of economic documents, of historical economic documents. And for this part of the research, we used documents called the Economic Reports of the President. They exist to this day, and they hold not only economic indexes, but they combine it with an analysis by the economic advisors, and the president makes some suggestions for the Congress to make some legislations to improve the economy and etc. This analysis was based on a methodology called the document analysis as proposed by Bowen. And here is an overview of my results from analyzing these economic reports. We could classify the period in 3 parts, which I'm going to go into details over the next few slides. So now we need to understand how science training especially, went from a non-priority to a matter of national security here. The first period we called science training as a known priority. It goes from 1950 to 1953. And we have to understand that during the World War II, the United States implemented what they called a wartime economy, which meant higher taxes, less incentives for schools and hospital constructions, more focused on the military sectors. But after the end of the war, the country kept this economy until 1950, when there was a shift towards a peacetime economy, which basically meant the opposite. So lower taxes, more incentives for the construction of schools and hospitals, the military sector became secondary, and there would be a lot more focus on internal developments. But then the Korean War started. This was proposed in January 1950, and the war started in June 1950. So that meant that the peacetime economy didn't last long. There was a return for the wartime economy. So during this period, that goes from that covers those 3 years, science training was considered non-priority, as we can see from these excerpts. So they say, the more successful we are in this twofold task to increase production and allocate products in proper sectors, the less difficult it will be to meet promptly the increased military demand for goods and services, both for ourselves and for the free nations associated with us, without impairing the civilian economy or weakening the industrial potential upon which our military potential depends. In a later passage from the same document, they state that there should be the creation of a governmental credits for construction, which requires a compulsory allocation program, not only to assure adequate military supply, but also to prevent price and costs increases. This program should therefore provide for a limitation of non-essential use. This would reduce the total demand to match the supply. This non-essential use becomes clear with the following years when they state clearly that in education, in health and social security programs, we must continue to be highly selective. Deferring improvements and extensions not clearly necessary now in support of the total defense effort. Only one warning was made by the economic advisors in the document from 1951 that said that shortages in scientific and health professions and of workers trained in skills required by some of the defense industries exist and will increase. After saying something about the manpower policies that shouldn't be taken seriously right now due to war, they continue by saying that these include virtually all of the major health professions, many types of scientists and engineers. During the second period, from 1954 to 1957, science training was viewed as important for economic progress. So in 1953, we had two important events that may have impacted the change of perspective regarding science training, which were the end of the Korean War in July 1953 and Eisenhower's inauguration in January 1953. So the end of the Korean War meant that there was the end of the wartime economy, a shift towards the peacetime economy that I mentioned, and that would mean a new perspective for science training. And after a new president takes over, it's expected that he has new goals for the economy and for the country, and that would also mean a new perspective. But that's not the whole picture. We have the release in 1955, Nicholas DeWitt released his PhD research called Soviet Professional Manpower. DeWitt was a part of the Russian Research Center from Harvard University, and his book was a detailed research regarding various aspects of the Soviet educational system, from primary and secondary education, all the way until professional and specialized manpower. One important finding was the 2-to-3 ratio. So while the United States was training 2 scientists, the Soviets were training 3 scientists. So this wasn't exactly new information, But now they knew that not only the Soviet Union was training more scientists, they were training better scientists. We believe this research affected the changing perspective because the WIT's research was funded by the National Science Foundation, while the Russian Research Center was funded by the CIA. Also, his findings were publicly known in July 1954 with his work being published on a journal. The document from 1954 refers to science research and scientific knowledge as a fundamental condition for economic progress and I'm sorry, got lost here. So let me just read the quote. A fundamental condition of economic progress is a growing fund of scientific and technological knowledge. So this was the new perspective from the first document the Eisenhower government published. If we compare the numbers of mentions of the word research between the documents, we can see that in 1954, the word research was mentioned almost 2 times more than all of the mentions from previous documents combined. And in the document from 1955, they continue this perspective by saying that among the activities is essential to economic progress in which there is a large public interest is the field of education, extending from education for literacy to the highest reaches of theoretical inquiry. This, together with DeWitt's research, implicated in the creation of a committee named National Committee for the Development of Scientists and Engineers by the President Eisenhower. Here we have the goals of this committee, which were to aid the federal government in identifying issues related to the development of skilled scientists and engineers. They needed to invite people and private organizations to help the federal government to tackle the lack of skilled scientists and engineers. This committee should supply information to interested parties on ways to overcome the obstacles for training of scientists and engineers. They should inform the general public about the problems and solutions to gather support and provide the president from time to time with a report of their progress. This was not the only committee created during this period. Here we have a few of them. The U.S. President's Committee on Science Education, on Education Beyond High School, which intended to understand how to encourage students to continue education after graduating from high school. The NSF began to publish yearly reports on scientific manpower, the situation, and how to improve and what could be done. This green one is the committee I mentioned earlier. And this one is a report that it's called Development of Scientific Engineer and Other Professional Manpower. All of these committees had their own goals, but the idea was to provide the federal government with information and solutions that would be applied throughout the country in a more centralized manner. The third period is really influenced by the launch of Sputnik, which put Eisenhower in the middle of this turmoil. And actually, public fear forced Eisenhower to anticipate an address he would make. He started by saying this: "I could not possibly deal with this subject in one address." And the name of this address is Science in National Security. This marks the beginning of the third and last period we categorized, which is called Science Training as National Security and goes from 1958 to 1960. Among many topics, the president tried to calm down the population by saying that investments in science were already being made with over $46.5 billion in investments. This is already inflation adjusted from that period, so it's current money. He asked people to revise their local curriculum and to keep in mind that when a Russian child graduates from high school, he has had 5 years of physics, 4 years of chemistry, 1 year of astronomy, 5 years of biology, 10 years of mathematics going through trigonometry, and 5 years of a foreign language. And he sets 5 points that could help to solve this situation. The creation of a national examination system for high school students, a system of incentives for high-performing students to pursue a career in science, programs to encourage high-quality math and science teaching. It was important to provide more laboratories, and there should be measures such as grants to increase the training of qualified teachers. In the documents, it became more explicit. There was a relationship between scientific knowledge and national security, as we can see here, where they said, the security and well-being of our people depend upon timely and adequate investments, not only in physical structures and equipments and weapons, but also in knowledge and skills. If we allow a gap to develop and persist in favor of the communist bloc, our influence in struggle for peace may be seriously diminished. An important legislation that was enacted during this period was the National Defense Education Act of 1958, and it gave even more power for the federal government to act in local educational systems in order to achieve the goals necessary for national defense. The area of influence extended beyond formal education, as Disney released multiple animations throughout this decade, such as these shown here, Man on the Moon, Man in Space, Our Friend the Atom, and Mars and Beyond. This is being studied now. This is the next part of our research, and we used a Gramscian framework to understand this attempt to create what we call a new common sense regarding science by incentivizing pupils to follow a scientific career through culture. So to wrap things up, here are some conclusions and thoughts about the relationship between science education and periods of political instability. So there are clear evidence of how political instability changed education, as we could see with the case of Nazi Germany and the United States during the Cold War. During this period, science education needed to be adapted to achieve specific goals. In Nazi Germany was to awaken the desire to defend the country, and in the United States was to train more scientists. With due proportions, both used science education as a means for national security. This leads to the question, what are the current goals of our science education? A broad question considering educational changes are taking place in many countries. One of the changes being implemented worldwide, which is a future perspective for our research, is the STEM or STEAM. So which goals does a country expect when implementing this methodology? I thank you all for your attention. Here's my email. You can contact me. And that's it.
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you very much. You can stop sharing the screen so we can see people.
Great.
Thank you so much. We'll go for if you can use the reaction button and raise your hand if you want to ask a question. It's going to be most welcome. Felipe will gladly answer. Nathalie, do you see the question? I'm not sure I see it. Margarida? Okay.
Then first of all, many thanks for this insightful presentation, because when we are learners, I'm not on didactics of the science education at Sylvie, but as the experience of being a student on science education is that is something that is like not considered from the perspective of the socio-cultural context in which this is produced. And I think it's super important to have this perspective in order to understand how how science is also having an agenda that is not just neutral one. And I wanted to know at which point you consider that nowadays international research collaboration could help into overcoming this nationalistic intentions of using science in a way or another, than how international communities or international efforts can help maybe on overcoming these aspects, or no, maybe, I don't know.
Margarita, est-ce que tu as une radio derrière toi?
Non.
Non, OK. Merci.
Il y a quelqu'un, c'est ça, there's someone's phone microphone that was recording, interfering. So if you could check, that'd be nice. I'll let Felipe answer. Thanks.
Thanks for your question, Margarita. It's really important, in my perspective, this international community is important for us to see how it happens around the world. Maybe not to help solve the problem or the issue, but it's important for example, here we have Sylvie, which works gratefully with the Canadian or Quebecian curriculum. And it's a perspective that in Brazil, we are way behind. So we can look at what is going on around the world to understand how we can change ours. What actions can we do to improve our curriculum? So in my opinion, this is a great way for the international community to help each other, so we can discuss and understand what can be done. Because in Brazil, it's really hard for us to fight against some conditions, because population almost not now, but when Bolsonaro was elected, the population were really intensely involved in those movements like School Without Party or with other movements. So to show that what's happening around the world can be done there also, I think it's a really big help already, these discussions and the opportunity to understand.
Thank you, Felipe. Another question? Somebody will ask a question? I would have a question myself about right now in Brazil with your president, and you said since 2016, how concretely have you seen it shifted? And if you could give some concrete examples about physics teaching or chemistry teaching, kind of the curriculum, something that would be banned from addressing, or I don't know, I would like to hear what you have to say.
We are very lucky the people around him are incompetent. They want to implement some changes, but I'm gonna tell you a story. It happened in the Ministry of Education. They fired everybody, even the people that could hire people. So they couldn't hire people because there weren't people to hire people.
Okay.
There wasn't the personnel to do so. So they are really incompetent. They struggle to achieve what they want to. So they appointed like this person that was an ally of the School Without Party. And there aren't a lot of changes regarding this in teaching materials that could hurt or damage a long time, the system for a long time. There are a lot of lack of fundings, a lack of incentives that also hurt in some ways, but there isn't a change that occurred that it's harmful.
Okay. Right now.
So it's not materialized in a lot of ways. There are can you think about anything that happened?
Yes, I think that the the curricular change we had with this, Felipe, with the COOP we had, and the fast way they implemented the curriculum brings contradictory situations. The good one is that the teachers should move themselves to implement this curriculum and think about how to implement what they call formative itineraries, a kind of concept that prepare the students to life or to work. It's okay. The other problem, the worst part, that it's so fast that each school do what they want.
Yeah.
So there's a huge confusion how to implement this curriculum. And at the same time, teachers are working on and trying to create ways to implement concretely this, but it's each one doing
Their own
their own way.
Yeah, making sense of it. We have some, yeah. Yes, thank you. Super. Any other comments?
Hello, it's Alec Cooper. I'm in clinic. No, thank you very much. Very interesting subject. Do you have any information about, say, what are there parallel programs, or how has science education developed, say, in China or in Russia? Are there parallel? Obviously, there's mention of the Soviet Union and how their centralized educational policies had them get the Sputnik up there. I think the Chinese are, and the Japanese as well, are very ahead with STEM. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment, but it's not really great. The original idea for the Nazi Germany project was to study the Soviet Union and how they changed their curriculum during the war, especially the Cold War. But the problem is that I don't speak Russian or Chinese, so that's really hard to conduct a research when you struggle with the language. We recently have a colleague from our group that wants to study how Russia changed the curriculum. I don't know the specific time period. He's studying
in the 60s.
In the 60s, because we have a lot of materials that were translated from Russian to Spanish because they were used in Cuba.
Oh.
So that's something that will help him, which I didn't know. It's really amazing, this project, but this language barrier really makes it difficult for us to comment on or to understand this.
Yes, all materials, sorry, all Russian materials we had are translated that we could read, is translated in Spanish in Cuba, and there are a lot of them translated in French also. The Mir publisher.
Mir, oh
Mir.
yes, Mir, yes.
There are a lot in physics. There are a lot of physics books that we used in our graduation, or used it in our undergraduation course, because there are excellent books, but it's curious because there are also a propaganda. Every physics principle are some Russian discovered before an Occidental one. So after before Galileo, someone knew in Russia knew the inertial principle.
But that would be the other problem, I guess, with countries like China and Russia, particularly. You cannot just go in and start searching through their archives. I guess it must be much more secretive. Anyway, thank you very much. I've got my waiting rooms piling up. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks for being here.
I have another comment about this, that one of our students are trying to understand the Korean.
I was about to ask a question about the Koreans.
Yes, because Korea for us, it's important because is one of the countries we compare ourselves.
Oh,
Because in the 19th, we are in the same situation
okay.
in public science publications,
Okay.
number and distribution of publication. Then in 20 years, they go ahead and we are
Skyrocket.
behind. So
Yeah, okay.
we are trying to understand some of the curricular changes they made and how because I think that it was very intense school in Korea. A lot of students are under pressure there. So I don't know if you could do this in Brazil, but it's important to understand. And they are publishing their curricula changes in English.
Okay.
So it's better to understand what happened there.
So anybody else has a question?
Marta sent a
Marta,
question here
okay,
on
Philippe.
chat.
Okay, I'll read Marta's question. How do you believe that the knowledge you are building relating science education to country necessities, not so noble sometimes, would explain STEAM education being applied here in Brazil? That's an interesting, because STEAM is it's very popular all across the world. So it's a question of goals too. So what about you in Brazil and STEAM?
The issue, I'm not going to call an issue because it's a problem, but the question regarding STEAM and STEM is, what is behind it? Why are we applying it everywhere thinking it's going to save science education? I think it's more of a question regarding how it's being implemented and which goals are behind the implementation of this type of methodology, and why this methodology and not others. And it's interesting because we have a speech, I think, from Barack Obama saying that they need to invest in science. It's the same history being repeated. And now we see that STEM and STEAM are being used as PSSC was to fight against China, to be ahead of China, so we won't lose financially to China. So it's really close to what we are studying, but as an ongoing process, it's really hard to look and understand. So it's better for us to focus on PSSC, so we can create some categories and some analysis processes, so we can look at the moment right now and say, wow, this happened, so it's expected. So because of this, we have to look at those circumstances. So I think this is how I can contribute to this discussion.
I think that the STEM, as the curricular reform, have two dialectical consequences. It's good, it's bad. Because it's good in the sense that teachers move with the necessity of implementation of something like STEM. What's STEM? STEM is what people are doing. There's no a general law about the STEM saying, oh, you should do this. In any part of the world, people are doing STEM in some way.
Yes, it's true.
But the worst part is that we are consuming STEM acritically. So we don't know the historical process that bring this kind of activity to our lives or to our schools. We just accept that it's important, and we are not discussing some issues that in science education we are discussing for more than 20, 30 years. What's interdisciplinarity? What's hands-on? Where the critical thinking in the educational process? We are not discussing. We're just implementing all over the world this STEM that we are hybridizing with a lot of ways of thinking science education. So I think that's just two faces, consequences at the same time. I don't know.
Thank you, Cristiano. Raul, you have a question, comment?
Yes, some question. Thank you, Felipe, for for your presentation. It was very interesting. I like this subject because it's actual. It's a problem, the actual problem in other parts of the world, Africa, European. I want to know is that you use in your methodology, you use the document analysis. I want to know if you have any idea about the point of view of Korean science teacher on the relationship between the instability, the political instability and science education. Thank you.
Okay, so if I rephrase, the current science teachers and the actual instability in Brazil, Raul, you mean? Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, right now. Yeah.
It's
That's
really,
a good question.
Yes, it's thank you for your question, Haru. It's really complicated. As Luciano was mentioning these formative itineraries, I was just talking with Sylvia about the situation there. We don't have physics and chemistry and biology as disciplines anymore. We have these formative itineraries. For example, we have an itinerary named Body, Movement, and Health.
Okay,
So it's interesting. The teacher from physics could teach, the biology teacher could give this discipline. The physical education teacher, the PE teacher could also give this discipline. But the problem is neither of them are prepared to give this discipline or any of other formative itineraries. So what they are trying to do, at least in our state, is to gather more teachers, so get more teachers to work in the educational system, because it's so underpaid and undervalued that many people graduate as a science teacher and work at banks, at financial institutions, because they would earn more. So, then this is interesting because I was going to university and listening to the radio, and there was a propaganda saying that come teach in our educational system. We will pay teachers, and I'm going to convert to Canadian dollars, around 1,000 and 2,000 Canadian dollars. So that's per month, okay? That's not a lot of money. We have a lot of problems in our economic system also. And so to solve the issue, because this didn't resolve the problem, teachers that were formed didn't rush in to go to work. They are getting pedagogues, so teachers that work with children, to teach some disciplines in high school, because we don't have teachers. So this is the situation we are having to deal with right now. We have also, I have a scholarship, so I'm not in the schools working, but we have in our group many teachers that they are working with all they have. They're trying to make it happen as it happens, because it was such a hushed implementation of this curriculum that no one knows how to deal with the problem. Mm-hmm. Problems will arise. So, but there are so many problems in all stages that it's hard to find the solutions to each one of them.
I can say that a contradiction generates another contradictions when you're trying to overcome it. So the curricular reform was implemented so fast. They didn't, I don't know if it's an expression or French, combine with the Russians or arrange with the Russians, okay. the problem, because we have textbooks that are disciplinary. We have teachers formation course that are disciplinary. So we teach physics teachers, biology teachers, chemistry teachers. We produce physics textbooks, biology textbooks, chemistry textbooks, and we have an interdisciplinary STEM, everything at the same time curriculum. and everybody is completely
Lost.
lost. So we don't know if it will last to the change of our government, because we have elections in November, in October. And hopefully we could change our government, hopefully. And also fix some of these problems of disconnection between all the educational actions we have in this moment. So it's a difficult situation. Teachers are very lost and unhappy with this situation. And I don't know, I hope we could do this in the next year.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. And I think we're gonna, oh, yes, thank you. And thank you for attending. And merci, Nathalie. So we can stop the recording and we'll make it accessible on the CRERES site.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Goodbye, thank you.